Sonal, we read all the way to the end.
Yes, all the way to the end.
Yeah.
And we wanted to do that because we wanted to discuss the rest of the book so that next week, when we are honored to have Rebecca Mackay, the author, join us, we can just speak with her and just have a conversation in our virtual book club about the book in its entirety.
Yeah. So just to recap where we are, or do we, I can't remember which order we go in. Do we introduce David
Yes.
first, or do we recap?
Yeah. So first, why don't we just, I'll do it briefly and earnestly. So first of all, welcome Chicago House Book Clubbers. Nabila and I are so happy. We're always happy every Thursday to host this conversation with you all. This is one of my favorite things to do and that I look forward to doing every week. And we will be discussing the rest of the book that we read. So we finished to the end, as Nabila mentioned. And so the theme for tonight's discussion will be HIV and AIDS healthcare. It will be also what it's like to be ill and to be taken care of and to have so many organizations and individuals involved in care. And what that space was like in terms of friendships, as well as organizations, as well as HIV and AIDS activism. So there was a lot of ACT UP organizing, toward the latter part of this book that Yale wound up becoming very involved in. So those are some of the themes, the anchoring themes for this conversation. And David, as a longtime advocate, and someone we're so happy to be with us tonight, who is also president and CEO of Howard Brown Health, can really help ground our discussion by sharing both his personal advocacy and professional experiences working in this space. So first of all, welcome to you all, book clubbers. Welcome, David. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for welcoming me.
We're looking forward to a fantastic conversation. And so with that, Nabila, I'll turn it over to you to give a brief recap before we dive into the discussion.
Okay, all right. So where we left off last week and where we started this week was Fiona is in Paris, and who shows up but Julian, the last person that a ghost from the past. And so there's a lot of discussion of living ghosts in the very last part of this book. So first of all, it is sort of her initial shock, and then ultimate grace and joy at rediscovering someone, sort of like who she thought, there's a great line in it that says something like, Julian was out living his life these last 30 years, whereas what she'd been doing is tending graveyards, not realizing that one of the graves was empty. And I was just like, it's just, honestly, I very well might start crying again, because like I've had a minute, and it was such a beautiful line and such a beautiful idea, and how much she knows that sort of how many people were infected, and she knows what Yale's relationship with Julian was. I still don't I haven't quite figured out whether Yale actually ultimately was infected by Roman. Is that right, everyone? Is that your understanding of what happened? So it came from Roman's what's the word I'm looking for? Not dangerous behavior, but irresponsible behavior.
It alluded to that, but I have that question mark too.
I have that question mark still, but I think I fall on the side that it was Roman.
Yeah.
And I think
because he said he was a virgin, but he wasn't a virgin. So there's that opportunity to.
And he was, sort of like he was out. There's a phrase I'm looking for. It's not irresponsible behavior. It's not dangerous behavior. It's whatever it is. We're using it with coronavirus at the moment as well. It's unthinking behavior. It's just
denial. Yeah.
Right. And so
cavalier.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So where we are now is Yale, sort of like we're jumping forward, and we're jumping to a point where Fiona's pregnant, and we are oh well, there's a little sliver in there where she when the ACT UP march happens, which actually, Teresa, I want to come back to it, because you mentioned that you had been in that march that is mentioned in the book. You mentioned that. We touched on it a little bit last week. I want to come back to that. So there's a portion where we talk about Yale at the beginning of his illness, or, the illness is just starting to take over. He's, he talks about insurance, he talks about healthcare, he talks about how much 3 days worth of pills is costing him. 3 days of pills is costing him like $80 or something. There's like 85 different pills that he has to take over those 3 days. And at that time, is the first time we see Fiona in love, and she's in love with her professor, and sort of like Yale makes this comment of sort of like what a thing it is to see, or what a thing it is to witness that Fiona happy, and then we jump forward, and it is Fiona pregnant, and at the same time it is Yale in the last throes of the disease. And it turns out that Yale passes away the same day that, or the day after Claire is born. And Claire holds with her throughout her life this image of Fiona as Saint Fiona of Boys Town. Whereas, sort of like Fiona, in all of this, I have thought throughout, Fiona has just tried to do her level best with and for everyone. And I've loved Fiona's character throughout this book. I mean, what a wonderful, wonderful woman, and how, and I would have taken Saint Fiona of Boys Town as a badge of honor rather than as a slight, which is the way her daughter delivered it. And then we live through the very last part of the book is we live through Yale's death, the drowning, sort of like the drowning through pneumonia. We live through the secret that Fiona has carried ever since Yale's passing, and that is that Yale's mother did show up at the very end, but I don't blame her for turning her away. I really don't. And we, sort of like we end up with the very last chapter. And I think it's good that the very last chapter is Paris rather than the very last chapter being Yale's passing, because it is a renewal, and it is a hope, and it is a linking between the past and the present and the future.
Absolutely.
And that's précis of the last part of the book.
Mm-hmm. That's a great summary, Nabila. Thank you. Thank you. Why don't we take a couple minutes, and of course, David, we have some kind of specific framing questions for you, but I would love to hear, based on Nabila's summary, from everyone here. And David, we know that you know Rebecca, the author, and that you've read the book. But for everyone here in the virtual book club discussion, what were some key moments that really stood out to you? And then we'd love to sort of ground the discussion in the theme and bring David in.
Thanks, Shelly. Thanks, everyone. I'm honored to be part of your book club. And sorry I missed the previous sessions. I read the book last year when it came out. And actually, Howard Brown, we hosted a lecture series with Rebecca. Mm-hmm. And I got to moderate that and ask her, pose her the questions, and it was actually fascinating. I really enjoyed it, and really enjoyed the book. The book was very personal for me. So, the level of detail of the era of Chicago and the North Side that she paints was so accurate. It gave me chills. Mm. And even some of the characters. I mean. I'm a little older than Yale in real life than the fictional character, but I went to Northwestern in 1987 and so discovered Chicago similar to the way Yale discovered it. And one of my jobs on campus was working in a gallery. So, you know, there's lots of these like odd little overlaps between the narration and my own life. So that was interesting journey. But she definitely did her research, and she really got into not only the period, but for me, got into the psyche of a gay man in that era, and what being part of this unfolding public health disaster was like. And maybe something that we can really identify with right now as we're living the one that we're in right now. So that's all I'll start with.
Thank you. Other reflections?
On HIV/AIDS or on the book?
Just for anyone in terms of the book, and as well as the theme of HIV and AIDS and caretaking and healthcare and advocacy and activism. So this is an open question to everyone.
Well, I guess, I don't know if this falls in line with the themes you just said, but I really loved that Yale's reason to live kind of became through the gallery pieces hanging side by side, and like seeing the, even though I guess one of them was kind of fraud or whatever, like seeing, having that closure of seeing the lovers side by side in the afterlife was kind of his way of like vicariously kind of having like, kind of like a successful love. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think the whole book, ultimately, to me, you know, it could have been such a depressing book, but I you know, sort of like I just said, I'm left with hope, and I'm left with how powerful love really can be. Even for Yale, you know, sort of like how Yale felt about Charlie, even for Charlie, Yale showed up at the end. And it was, even though it was such an awful parting for the two of them, you know, sort of like, I think our love for each other, for our friends, for our community, for our people, at the end of the day, it is the single driving force. For me, certainly, it is the singular driving force that just gets us through. And I think that whether it was Nora and Ranko, or whether it was Charlie and Yale, or whether it was Fiona and her love for the boys, or Fiona and her deep love for her child, and her desire to reconnect with her child, that theme of love just strings these pearls all the way through this book.
This is Teresa. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I wanted to add something because Nabila, you touched on it in your recap about ghosts, you know, and something that just kept tugging at my heartstrings was when this idea of when you're the person left behind, you're the keeper of the memories. Mm-hmm. And there's a reference to the street names in Boys Town, right? And each time the author describes a street, you know, I think about walking down the streets, and I think Anna kind of alluded to this about when you know, recognized some of the locations. That idea that the term she used was that the streets are left behind and they are the keeper of their own history. Mm-hmm. And thinking about the fact that all these people who have lost their lives and they walked on those streets, right? And they left their history there. And it just kept tugging at my heart because you know, when we go to Pride Parade and we're walking down those streets, there's people that had lost their lives that would walk down those streets and want to be happy and live their lives freely. And that's what that location represents, right? So that's something I just wanted to say that I kept coming back to, and also being the people who are left behind. You have all this love, you're left with, and what do you do with it, right? and people, you know, what do you do with it? It's such a hard thing when you lose somebody you love.
Mhm.
I couldn't help but be, to your point, Teresa and Nabila, about love and memory, of how incredibly, I mean, my hat's off to Fiona, to have lost so many people that she loved.
Oh my God.
And still, and also be dealing with the fact that trying to reconcile her relationship with her daughter, Claire, and not giving up on that, considering everything she'd been through. I mean, how many people can you love and take care of and party with and advocate with and take care of and who have died, and not be so cynical that you just sort of give up on human relationships altogether, that you give up on intimacy, that you give up on being on vulnerability. And yet, not that it was easy for her, it was hard, it was painful. Like, I can't even imagine the number of funerals she went to, the number of tears that she cried. And yet here she took care of all of them. She loved all of them. She remembered all of them. And then to see this kind of hopeful future for her relationship with Claire. And there was a point, I can tell you one that it really brought me to tears. Remember when, so Julian emerges and she just assumed that he had died, right? And then here he is, he appears on, Richard said, I have a surprise for you, so she is at Richard's place in Paris. She opens the door and there is Julian 30 years later. And she was shocked because Julian had gone to Puerto Rico to die, and he wound up, thank goodness, and this is the other thing too that we'll bring you in on too, David. There had been enough advancement in medicine and in the medications where there was a kind of, I think, combination, I think it was AZT and something else, that he was able to take advantage of. And especially because his mother embraced him back into her home and was willing to remortgage or refinance, I should say, her home so that she could cover the cost of his medication. So because of the advancement in medication, because of his good fortune of having a mother who took him in and who took care of him, he was able to actually live with this illness instead of dying like his other friends. And so that's not something that, his friends had and that many other people had. And so here he is 30 years later. And then, so Fiona and Claire and Julian are at the Pompidou in Paris. And they start out in the gift shop. And Claire is just, you can tell she's letting out all of the anger and pain and the daggers, and she's not holding back. And Fiona, being this mother who just wants to really have a relationship with her daughter, she's holding it. Like, she's like, I'm not going to throw daggers back. I'm not going to justify anything. I'm just going to sit here and listen and absorb and just, hold the space. And Julian is there to witness this. And in a non-preachy way, not in an overbearing way, he's just there. And Fiona mentioned how comforted she was by his presence. And then they're on an escalator, the three of them, and they're going, I think, up to one of the installations. And what really touched me was, so Julian is hearing the back and forth, and Claire is hurt because she thought that Fiona regretted her being born, when really Fiona was just feeling the loss of Yale and so many others she had lost. And Julian, I don't remember, my book is upstairs, I don't remember exactly what he said, but what was so profound was he talked about both how long and how short life is. Yeah. And I thought that in a very non-preachy, non-after-school program way, he was saying, you may think that this is insurmountable, this kind of tension between you two, but it isn't. Mm-hmm. You have enough love, and almost as if to say in a non-judgmental way, don't fuck up this opportunity. Yeah. Like, I'm still here, I'm alive, look at how much you've lost, look at how many people do not have a shot at being with their loved ones again. You can do this.
Yeah. He said something along the lines of, that we're all on Earth at the same time. Teresa just typed it up, that we're all on Earth at the same time, and how miraculous that is. And also, I thought it was a lovely line where he said, you know, everybody's concerned about how short life is, but also life, you know, the arc of life is like really long. It can, you know, page 401. Thank you, Jason. Yeah, it's and that's it. That's exactly it. And he what a lovely character. I mean, you want to think he's incorrigible, and you want to think I shouldn't like him, but you can't. And that was another part where I really kind of choked up, was where, you know, it's in the last chapter, and, you know, Fiona is reminiscing that there she is, she's standing right there, and Julian is making this conversation about himself, and she can just see those ghosts. They're all standing with her, all of those boys that have died, you know, and they're all standing with her, and they're all rolling their eyes, because of course he would make it about himself. And I think it's, and it is wonderful. He goes to Puerto Rico, and I think there's a great tie-in with last week. David, last week we had Julio Rodriguez join us, and it was wonderful. And he talked about how, you know, what is now Boys Town, what it used to be like, and how it was a Puerto Rican heavy area, and how, you know, so it was a great tie-in for me. I'd forgotten that Julian goes initially to Puerto Rico and spends this time trying to recover and get the drugs in Puerto Rico. And then he comes back, and his mother, and he manages to live long enough. And I think the breakthrough, going back to your question or your point, Kelly, the initial breakthrough was AZT. You know, AZT, which initially was, you know, sort of like this drug that was like a thalidomide drug, right? The initial drug was not, you know, so that was the initial breakthrough, but the real recovery came in the 90s, when there was the combination of the AZT with 2 other drugs. So you ended up with a triple therapy that was able to reverse the course and at least allow your T cells to come back up, and then, you know, sort of like allow like recovery to start taking place. But I wanted to turn over to David, because throughout this book, we see the beginnings of Howard Brown, and we see the roots that are laid for our Chicago community in Howard Brown.
Can I say something before we go to David really quick? Sorry, Dave, just that Yale, Julian, even the way that Kelly said it about his mom and how she refinanced the house, there's like this shame around abundance and excess, right? And like the fact that he was leaving was like, okay, well, I mean, I can't do that. And I feel like that's very similar. That's now also, where it's like, if you have excess and if you have resources, you're almost embarrassed to say it. Like me right now, I'm in my parents' house, and I feel like I'm in my parents' house, you know, and I had something else to say about grief, but I'll save that for later. We can go into the medicine stuff.
Okay. Well, more than the medicine stuff, it's for me, Howard Brown is an anchor, right? For us in our community. And it has been, as you know, what comes out in this book is right from the beginning days of our activism here in Chicago. Howard Brown has been a pillar. And so maybe we can turn it over to you to talk a little bit about, you know, Howard Brown then, Howard Brown now, and Howard Brown tomorrow.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you for reminding me of parts of the book. I read it last year. I meant to review it before today, but they're doing work in our building, so my office got packed up, including the book. So I didn't have a chance to see it. But yeah, but for me, reading the book, you know, was sort of like reading parts of my diary that I never wrote. You know, there were lots of little vignettes that really felt so personal, so real. And I think, you know, it feels like not that long ago, but I guess it was quite a while ago. I think it's in that period of time, you know, it was sort of, there was such it was kind of this era, the 70s, or this era of just a jubilation of discovering gay liberation and sexual liberation, and sort of defiantly kind of breaking those norms, kind of fighting homophobia, including internalized homophobia with our own bodies, and kind of discovering each other and celebrating that. And so it's hypersexual period, kind of this adolescence for a community that felt like it was denied one. And then when AIDS hit, I think there was just this communal sense of shame and guilt, and kind of sort of destiny, we were doomed to be, there something bad was going to happen to us. And I think for every person living with HIV, felt that sense of doom at being diagnosed with HIV. That it's some little part of your soul kind of said, I brought this on myself. At least in that era. And there were parts of the book that I think really got into the psyche of these men that felt so scarred, and also so robbed of this opportunity to play and be free and to love. And so that really touched me. And Howard Brown's history is, Howard Brown's in the book, which is exciting, but it's, we also were throughout this whole arch. So Howard Brown started by a group of medical students from the University of Chicago in 1974 at a kitchen table like the one I'm at now. Laura is over a cup of coffee, a pot of coffee and a couple students. And they were really concerned about the lack of access for affirming sexual health and behavioral health for therapy for gay men. And so they started, the students started a volunteer effort to provide STI screenings and counseling services for our community, and a very kind of garage apartment start, like most organizations, like Chicago House itself. And eventually moved into an office on Clark and Fullerton, across from the theater up there. And that's really the early beginnings of the organization. It was really trying to provide, kind of vital services, both counseling and behavioral health. And the organization also was the start of two organizations, actually. The social services split off and formed Gay Horizons. So our beginnings were together. And then Gay Horizons went on to do kind of these social services and social activities, and Howard Brown stayed focused on the clinical. And in '74, Dr. Howard Jr. Brown, who had served as the Commissioner of Health in New York City for about 18 months, and had been the first kind of public official to come out, and in a very public way. So when he came out in the 70s, it was front page news of the New York Times. He didn't come out in office. He actually, he was in a closet as the Commissioner of Health, but there was a rumor that the local press was investigating secret or closeted gay people in power, and were planning to out them, including Dr. Brown. So he stepped down, but he did come out publicly at a conference, at a medical conference. And because, at that time, the society just believed you had to be a hairdresser or, a beautician to be gay. You couldn't be a doctor, for God's sakes. And so that was front page news, and he went on to form the Gay and Lesbian Task Force. And really the big is really credited with, through the task force and other advocates, persuading the American Psychiatric Association to remove homosexuality from the list of recognized mental health disorders, and, which is huge, a huge achievement. He had poor health, he had poor heart health, poor weight management, smoked. He died in his 50s of a heart attack in '74. And he was born in Peoria, Illinois, raised in Ohio. but because he had kind of Illinois roots, our founders wanted to recognize his memory. So that's how Howard Brown became then Howard Brown Memorial Clinic. And then we just Howard Brown Health. And Howard Brown was right there at the beginning of the 80s when the epidemic kicked off. We were on the front lines, and Howard Brown was really, not unlike these characters, forced to mature really fast, and it's sort of against its will. But the organization expanded rapidly in the mid 80s to bring on research projects and social services and social work and palliative care and hospice services. And in the 80s and early 90s, there were really no effective treatments. It was all about reducing opportunistic infections or trying to prevent them or treat them. And at the end, really helping people die with dignity. I mean, that was really all we had. And AZT was a really important first generation antiretroviral. It was exciting because it was proven in the labs to kill the virus. But the virus, because it replicates so quickly, the life of the virus is 8 hours. So, it has multiple generations in a day, and so it can mutate resistance to AZT in about 3 months. So it was very toxic medication, very difficult to take, lots of side effects, and was effective against viral replication for all of 3 months or 4 months. So that was not an effective way of keeping people alive, but it was kind of it did prove the theory that one, you could stop replication, and it also proved the theory that the virus was the disease. I mean, I think for a very long time there's a lot of conspiracy theories, nothing you've heard of, that the kind of immunosuppression AIDS was being caused by something not HIV. That there was another force that was acting out, and this really proved the concept. And so in '96, other agents used in combination came out with the first line of protease inhibitors, and that was the first time people were able to sustain viral suppression and effectively stop replication. But from '96 to well into the 2000s, we were still figuring out how to dose it and manage side effects. And so we knew it would keep people alive, but how much and in what quantity and how to deal with the side effects took at least a decade more. And Howard Brown was along that whole journey. And actually Howard Brown's story is tied to that whole legacy. I mean, in the 90s, when we did have effective treatments, government programs like the AIDS Drug Assistance Program ran out of money in months, because there was just not enough funding for all the people who needed assistance. And so we had to advocate vigorously for additional funding and support to make sure that those programs could be adequately funded to keep up with the demand. And that brings us, things. And then our next chapter is really around. I mean, there's many kind of little twists and turns, but I'd say certainly in modern history, I'd say the Affordable Care Act has really transformed care in a really radical way, because before so many people were categorically unable to get insurance if they didn't have workplace insurance, but they had pre-existing medical conditions and they were barred from buying insurance products on the private market. So they were perpetually uninsurable because of HIV. And Medicaid, the safety net, had a two-pronged test. You had to be income eligible, so very poor, but you also had to have a meet a categorical definition, so either blind, disabled, aged, or what's the other one? In some cases, pregnant or an infant. And so disability was really the best route for Medicaid, but most people with HIV didn't meet the strict definition of disability until they were advanced AIDS. So you had to actually get sick by HIV to the point where you were unable to work to get the medications that could have prevented you from getting that sick in the first place. And so for decades, Howard Brown was caring for people that were perpetually uninsurable, and in this catch-22. And that changed, in 2014, when Illinois accepted Medicaid expansion, and it lifted that categorical requirement. So now I'm just blabbering.
So that's where, so that's, sort of the future for us really is, sort of like holding on to the Affordable Care Act and improving. I mean, I don't think anybody would disagree with me that, sort of like we, not only do we have to hold on to it, but it's, the Affordable Care Act is the floor, it is not the ceiling. We have to build on it.
Oh, absolutely.
We can't lose from it. I think, sort of like going back to, and also it would be a luxury to back then to say that we also would recognize trans rights. But I think now we've, going forward, I think that is an area that sort of like we can expand into, and I think that's a role. Certainly places like Howard Brown are at the forefront of that. So I think looking to the future, I think that's also an area that sort of like we would focus on, or that we have available to us.
David, I can say, wow. I feel like I have been given, first of all, it was just very, you touched on so many different points in terms of how even Howard Brown got started, who started it. And, I'm familiar with Howard Brown. I think I remember reading a while back how it got started, but I did not even know that it started with a group of students from the University of Chicago who came together and wanted to provide medical services, healthcare, et cetera. I did not know that. I did not know that Howard Brown, or I didn't remember that he was a health commissioner at the time and was facing potentially being outed along with his other LGBTQ colleagues. And so first of all, I just want to say that what this book, reading this book has encouraged me to do is brush up on the history, the political history, the social history of how these organizations got started and who. Mm-hmm. And because I think the foundation means everything. And so I have to say thank you so much for grounding us in that history, because I think it says a lot about, sort of brings us to like why it was so important in caring for people, and not just in sickness, but in health, and being a place where they could live and die in dignity, and being a place where also people could, focus on a population that was being so maligned and disrespected. People didn't care that queer people were dying. They just didn't, because it was seen as an illness of the queers, the sinful queers. People didn't care. And so I just want to thank you so much for bringing that perspective into the conversation.
Exactly. I mean,
thank you. Yeah, that's precisely why Howard Brown, and by that factor, why Chicago House exists. I mean, these are organizations that, under other conditions, might not need to be here. If the establishment, if the medical establishment, if the primary care and hospital establishment at the time had responded with love and care and compassion towards individuals affected by HIV, we might be in a very different place. But the same with housing and support services for people, and there's just such tremendous stigma. It is important not to forget that, because that's how all of this started, because we realized as a community that no one was going to do it if we didn't do it for ourselves. Mm-hmm. And Nabil is absolutely right. I mean, this is sort of the place we are with with our transgender, gender nonconforming community. That, you know, if we do not take leadership and champion their civil and human rights, their healthcare needs, their equity for income and jobs and dignity, then, you know, we're kind of repeating history. So that is very, very important. Yeah, and also some of the little vignettes also remind me of, and it's not even, it's a memory for me, but it's actually really relevant today, is how difficult those early days were for immigrants affected by HIV. And I had many dear friends who passed away in the early 90s. Actually, a good friend who worked at Stop AIDS Chicago, beautiful young man, really just the sweetest person in the world. Got very sick, retired. He was like 30. He couldn't work anymore. He was too sick. And he ended up moving back to Puerto Rico with his mom. I remember being at AIDS Foundation Chicago because we were colleagues and friends, and he had called me. He had called me out of the blue and sent me a picture, and we had a great chat. And it was just like, you know, hang in there. I hope you're okay. And I didn't realize at the time, but 3 weeks later he was dead. You know, he called to say goodbye. You know, another dear friend of mine from that era also was getting, you know, he was a young entrepreneurial gay man, Mexican descent, Mexican. He came from Mexico. Did drag. He's life of the party. He got very sick. He passed away. We contacted his sister, who came up for basically for like a little ceremony that his friends held at their house with his ashes. She didn't know he was gay. So she's coming to Chicago to find out that her brother, had this whole other life. And we came to learn that we knew him as Luis. We only knew him as Luis. You know, I knew him for 6-10 years. We only knew him as Luis. Luis was the name on the driver's license that he bought in Tulsan. His real name was Jose. And so he died with someone else's name. And, you know, kind of far from home. And that was like, that left such a indelible mark on my spirit. Like, oh my God, you know, with all that he had to go through to get here, survive, and live this tiny life, you know, this tiny fragment of a life. And we're, you know, and in the shadows, and we're seeing it now. We're seeing it right now with the COVID disaster that's hitting the West Side. We're doing work in Little Village, where we're seeing off the chart rates of COVID, corona disease. And we're in our site in Project Vita, where the first couple of weeks, we were seeing 60% of those tested were positive. And it's, you know, and again, it's a community, it's a lot of people that are working in factories and food processing plants, and living with either entire extended family in one apartment. And we saw a lot of people, we're seeing a lot of people with symptoms, but also a lot of people that are asymptomatic but know someone or work with someone or work where somebody who passed away was working, and they're all scared to death of losing their income. You know, the number one question is, will I get a doctor's letter that says I'm negative or I'm positive or I'm ordered to stay home? They want something official because they're not out, and many are not eligible for any government stimulus funding, and there's not that many resources. So holding on to this, you know, their essential jobs is important. But as I heard in the podcast, they're not treated like essential people, and that's a problem. So, so we're seeing some of these patterns just go on and on.
There are so many parallels between HIV and AIDS crisis in the book and now. Nabila, what do you think? I think I would love to engage the book clubbers into, like, what were some poignant moments for you in the book? I would love to,
Yeah.
this is for all of us here, I would love to get you guys' reflections.
Yeah.
Something that an idea that you touched on, David, about like people going what felt like too soon was definitely too soon. I felt that most in the book when they were talking about Nico and how he had a graphic novel or something that was kind of about the experience of someone living with HIV. And I wasn't very like invested in who Nico was as a person because they talked about him in the beginning and I kind of forgot about him. And then when they brought that up again and like later on in the story, it gave me a better picture of like what was at stake and like just the tragedy of everything. And I don't know, art speaks to me and yeah.
Anyone else have
Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, thank you, Anna.
I can say stuff, but I feel like it's always me and Anna. If anybody else wants to say anything.
Jason's pointing at himself. That's not true, Jason. But we'd love to hear from you on this.
But okay, I mean, while you guys are, I will say that grief is such a personal process, and there's a big difference in terms of, you know, then it was such a divisive thing where it was like, okay, it's only, you know, the godless queers or you know, whatever, and now it's like everybody. Now it's a very everybody is allowed to grieve also, which I think is really powerful. And when I really love the ending of the book, which is, I felt like this grief as we were coming to the end of the book where I'm like, oh no, I only have 10 pages left. My friends, Yale, you know, and I was getting really sad. And that bit where we have this buildup where we know that she's going to be touched by his voice, by Nico's voice. And when she actually hears him, I was crying, and I went and found some footage of one of my best friends that died, and nobody knows him. So nobody, you know, that's a very personal process. And I felt like I had a lot of unprocessed grief. Yeah. And I wept like, you know, where you're ugly at the end, where it's like mucus everywhere. And it was really powerful. It was really powerful. And I really felt so grateful to Rebecca for this collective healing.
Yeah. Anyone else?
I thought one thing that the book did really well was not just bringing to life these people, but also gave me fresh perspective. We talked about the streets of Chicago. I think Teresa had said it, like we all walk those streets, and this brought to life history on those streets from before I moved to Chicago that I just really don't think about, you know, just the lives that passed in Boys Town. And the other perspective is, I think there's this trope of that the caregivers were always these motherly characters, and we have two of those in this book. We have Teresa taking care of Charlie, and then we have off scene Julian's mom. But I actually thought Fiona as a caregiver brought to life the idea that caregivers aren't just motherly characters; they can also be sisters, they can be peers, they can be friends. And I thought that was really for me was a good expansive moment, that the book didn't just have, you know, the caregivers or the mom characters that come in. Of course, you know, Fiona has to come to terms with that later in her life when she wants to be a caregiving mom, but that's a separate thing.
Anyone else? That was a very good point, Jason. I think that throughout, you know, I always bring the experiences back to an immigrant experience or a brown experience for me. And one of the things, you know, sort of like that David brought up was, you know, sort of about finding community and then becoming responsible and speaking up for ourselves. And even last night, I had, I'm just going to relay a personal anecdote. Yesterday, there was a group of Muslims that invited Pete Buttigieg to be part of this forum. And they took 10 people, right? And there is this gay white man talking to these Muslims from all over the world. And, you know, sort of like, and Wajahat Ali, who's on CNN, was the guy that was leading the question and answer. And there were the 9 other people, and they were talking left, right, and center about all kinds of stuff. And it is the gay Christian white man telling these Muslims about being gay, and there was no representation. And so I actually, at 4 o'clock in the morning, I wrote to the forum and I said, you know, actually, I'll if you'll indulge me, I'm going to
indulge away, Nabila.
This is the CEO of the forum, and I said, hey, Salam. So this is 4 in the morning, so you have to remember I'm up to keep my fast. Alhamdulillah, we are in the last few days stretch of Ramadan. I feel sad at this point, as I feel that connections with the divine and spirituality of this month start to fade into the background almost before Eid is over, as normal life takes over. Mind you, who knows what normal is anyway. You know how much I love Mayor Pete and continue to support him to this day. I really enjoyed today's session with him, but I have one overarching comment about Concordia programming that came into sharp relief for me. Here we have a prominent gay politician come and talk to us, and at one point he even made the point of how much solidarity there is between the ostracism faced by the LGBTQ community and that faced by the Muslim community. So my question to you and the broader Concordian leadership is this: where is the liberal Muslim gay Concordian voice and programming, especially in a time of coronavirus, a time when, as an already ostracized group, gay Muslims are constructively shoved back into the closet? We have a prominent gay man of profound Christian faith addressing us, and we missed an opportunity to include a Muslim LGBTQ individual. Allies are wonderful, and they speak of a stated desire for diversity and inclusion, but it is a substitute or a veneer of inclusion and not actual inclusion. And so anyway, so it goes on like this. And this is, as I say, these are my thoughts at 4 o'clock in the morning. And I did get actually a really positive response back from the guy saying, we missed an opportunity. And I told them, you know, you've missed an opportunity. And it's a missed opportunity. The thing that the reason that comes to my mind is that there are communities, there are pockets of communities here in Chicago, and so Sonal, you're absolutely right that Muslim men are incredibly homophobic and incredibly, you know, and sexist and all of that. On top
Even
of
the
it.
ones that are like, I'm so open-minded.
So I said that.
I'm in entertainment. It's like, ugh.
That's right. That's right. And I said that in this thing that, you know, sort of like, if you're going to be a progressive, you know, where's the progress in progressive? If you're going to call yourselves a movement, where's your progress? And I said, it's 4 o'clock in the morning. So we have to understand that I'm, you know, and I've been fasting for a month. And so, but I'm left with a struggle. Like, I feel like we've struggled and struggled and struggled, and you know, we end up getting re-pushed into corners and into closets, and we just have to keep relying. We have to, and this is why I said right at the beginning of today was that, you know, Howard Brown is an anchor for us, because because that's the history. You're the custodians of our history. We have individual history, but organizations like Howard Brown are people that we can go back to, organizations and places that we can go back to say, okay, we did it once, we can do it again. Or we did it in this setting, we can do it again in another setting. So,
Nabila, can I just say thank you so much for sharing that, because as someone, you know, so I am not, you know, I'm not Muslim, you know, I'm not South Asian or any of those things, but what you said resonated with me hugely, because so often when I think of Muslim and LGBTQ, Black and LGBTQ, Buddhist, which is what I am, and LGBTQ, sometimes these things are seen as mutually exclusive. So as wonderful as it was for Mayor Pete you know, to speak from his experience and to be able to say, look, as someone who is LGBTQ and from a community that has been maligned and marginalized, you know, I feel a sense of a kind of connection, not that it's the same experience, but a kind of connection with any group, including Muslims that are marginalized. But how powerful would it have been if they had had someone who is Muslim and LGBTQ also there? And I think that the intersections, I know that's a word that's used a lot and people like to mock it, but there is something to be said about that idea of these intersections of experiences and demographic groups and communities, or whatever word that you want to use, being centered in some of these conversations, especially in moments where they're seen as mutually exclusive. So I'm just really glad and proud of you for elevating that voice.
Thank you. But I think, you know, this book, one of the things that this book has done is just, it's reminded me that that there are so many firsts. There are so many, you know, and if we don't step out and step forward and stand up for ourselves, nobody's out there going to stand up for us. And so we have to take that first step and we have to push back. And it's like, I mean, this forum that I'm talking, it's like CNN and NBC and all of these people that, you know better, do better. And that was one of the things that I said, we know better, so we need to do better. You know, and even in progressive communities and societies. So anyway, that was that part.
That was profound. You know, I think one thing I appreciate about Great Believers, bringing back the history and the kind of the ethos, the concerns of that era and that crisis of the 80s, is reminding us that the progress won is not progress assured. And you know, here's a community in the 80s that thought that they had made it. You know, they'd gone through civil rights. You know, women, they're the LGBT community highly influenced by the women's rights movement and kind of sexual liberation period. So it felt like nirvana, you know, in the 70s, like, you know, we're here, we're queer, we made it. And then boom, AIDS, you know, hit, you know, and, you know, even in our own recent memory, you know, we all, many on this call knew it was not going to be nirvana to just secure marriage equality, but but for a certain segment of our community, it was like, you know, we've arrived, we've marched through that door, and no one's going to push us back. And then boom, you know, Trump happened, you know, or COVID happened, and so nothing is, you know, any measure of progress we attain, we've got to work really hard to secure and to reaffirm, because it can be taken away from us. And it is being taken away from us right now, you know, through Trump and this pandemic is having a real effect all over the world. I think it's nothing is assured.
Yeah, I think it's terrifying that we are, you know, sort of like we are staring down the barrel of a virus on the one hand, you know, our whole government in disarray. Quite possibly us not having an election in November. It's, you know, it is not beyond the realms of possibility. And also not beyond the realms of possibility is Trump getting reelected. And if he gets reelected and we lose Ruth Bader Ginsburg, we're like, it's over. It is, we like the gains that we have won. And I'm so glad you mentioned gay marriage, because it feels to me as a brown queer woman, it feels like all of the emphasis that the gay white men, their thing was marriage equality, right? And it has felt to me in the last few years like, okay, once that was done, it's over, the fight is over. And it hasn't even begun. We haven't even stepped on the road yet. We haven't even left the house yet. I find that it's terrifying. It is absolutely terrifying. We're in a Yeah. I shouldn't get us
No,
both down and yeah.
I agree wholeheartedly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like the resources, the energy, the time, and the money, and you can see like the shift in. There's almost like a, you know, not across the board, right? I'm not trying to paint everyone with a broad brush, but there isn't this kind of push and sense of urgency about other types of inequities and really serious issues, health, employment, all kinds of things that LGBTQ folks, especially the most marginalized among LGBTQ people, are experiencing.
I did want to circle back to ACT UP again, and I did want to circle back to Teresa, if that's okay. I know some people have had to drop off, but so that march, which was in this week's reading, it wasn't in last week's reading. I know we touched on it last week, but so that march actually happened, right, Teresa?
Yeah, that's an actual march.
And,
yeah.
and you were here for it. Can you talk a little bit about where, you know, sort of like how the organizing happened for that? I mean, how did you hear of it?
I only heard of it. I mean, I was much younger, like in my first year of college, and I worked for a newspaper. So it was more, the word was getting out around my campus, and, you know, that there was going to be a march. And, you know, all I know is that I was there. You know, as far as how it was organized, you know, there's probably people with more history who could tell you that. But for me, it was learning about it as my younger years, and it was it opened my eyes to what being able to organize meant. You know, that you could get people together to call attention to something, raise awareness, and doing it like the die-ins in the streets and things like that. I think that was just my perspective. But having anything to do with it as an advocate was not, I was way not into the realm of that. It opened my eyes that I could do that. And I don't think I would have taken steps that what led me down a different path in my life if I hadn't seen that, is what I was referencing.
Yeah. David, were you in Chicago at the time?
I was not. I just, I wasn't at the march, and I might, if I was in Chicago, I was on campus at Northwestern. So I wasn't. I was had just arrived.
Yeah, it was just, that's one of the things that I have loved about Chicago ever since I moved here in '99, and throughout, I mean, whether it's marching for, sort of like what, I think there was a number of marches a couple of years ago for Gaza Strip. Before that, throughout the years, we as a community in Chicago have a rich and varied history of turning out, and we just can't lose it. Whether it's the immigration marches, whether it's the stuff, sort of like, whether it's, sort of like employment relations, whatever, on any number of levels. And I love that about Chicago. I think that's another character in this book. I think the activism in those marches.
Yes. I love that. I love the fact that you said that, because I do feel like in some ways this character that's a backdrop is my city, Chicago. And we definitely show up, we show out. And I have to say, when it comes to LGBTQ history and the present, I love the fact that Rebecca's book, this book, focuses on Chicago, because I do feel like in some ways we're sort of seen as flyover country in terms of the LGBTQ and, queer history. Like you think of, I guess, San Francisco and maybe LA and then New York, or, but there is so much here in Chicago that often doesn't get as much attention. So I totally agree with you on that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that was a comment that Rebecca made early on, that sort of like when people thought of the fight, the AIDS crisis fight, they thought about East Coast and West Coast, and nobody realized how many people were affected and afflicted and dying in Chicago. And so it's an incredible, I think it's an incredibly important character in this book. I wanted to ask one last question. I know we're over our time, and David, I'm very, very grateful for you giving us all of this time. I wanted to ask one question about Fiona. How many people thought Fiona was Rebecca? I keep wanting, I mean, I know she is younger than the Fiona character would be, but I wonder how much of her own personal experience is rolled into this book. And I don't know, David, you said that you know Rebecca.
How old is she, by the way? Do we know how old Rebecca is?
I don't know, she's on the back dust cover, so I don't, she looks quite
It looks like a really young picture, but I don't know how old that picture is.
I don't know, let's ask David.
Yeah, no, so we asked her a version of this question when she did the book reading for us. And she says that, all the characters are fictional. She identifies the most with Fiona. Mm-hmm. And she definitely, she was very concerned about who was telling the story, whose narration is this. And she, even though she flirted with the idea of making it a first-person account from Yale or one of the men, she didn't feel like that was authentic and something that she could channel. And so she made the choice to tell the story from Fiona's point of view. She thought that was a voice that she could authentically tell and could bring herself into. So she definitely, but she also was concerned about, even though she got very close to the community and did a lot of research, obviously, and really kind of got under our skin in a way that to me is eerie, she also had the humility to say, it's not my story. Mm-hmm. I'm a spectator. I'm an observer. I need to have the humility to tell it from that point of view. I also asked her, how did you, because there's certain passages that were so, they felt so, I was amazed that she found kind of these moments of deep insecurity and was able to tell them so authentically. And she said that is the job of the novelist, of the author, to find empathy, and that it's just empathy. And so if you write with empathy, you'll find those moments. And so she did it.
I was so moved by that. I love that question, Nabila, because I have to say, I was surprised because at the very end, I read her acknowledgement section, and she credited so many people who had lived these experiences, right? And she included Tracy Bain as one of them, which is not surprising. And what was so moving was she said, I did my best. And I'm like, oh, she said, if I've gotten anything off, I apologize. I really listened, I researched. I thank so many people who share their life experiences, their time, the work that they did, their advocacy. I did my best. Like, oh.
Yeah, that was lovely. Very, very good. Very good.
Well, I also think, we know the theme obviously is the AIDS epidemic, but, it resonates with me as a woman who is taking care of, someone who's dying, several people who is dying. I think it's just, it's just that lost when you love somebody so much. And I go back to that quote, the keeper of their memories. When you lose somebody, you do live with that, like every day of your life. It might be in the past, but you continue every day. You think about it. You think about how they lived, but you always think about how they died too. So I think it being that caretaker and that the person who survives, the theme that Nabila kept hitting on about survivor's guilt. I think, you could relate to that, and that's the empathy there, right? Yeah. That when you lose somebody, it lives with you for the rest of your life.
Yeah, for sure.
My name is Anthony. I think I had heard of this book. I haven't read it yet, but I really was intrigued by the conversation. And I think the thing that I'm struck with by everyone's comment is more how stories and storytelling is so important, because I think it humanizes universal experiences. And I think these types of stories are much more important now, given the climate we're working and living in, because I think it's easy to forget that our voices can't be heard. But I have to personally believe that as I keep telling my voice or tell my story, that there's a human element that everyone can relate to, even if we don't perceive them to be on our side. And that's really more my bigger hope personally, is that I think what I resonate the most with, thinking about like Harvey Milk's perspective of everyone coming out, so to speak. So by telling a story that's far more human, I hope that other people that I feel like may not be aligned with me can relate to me more on the human element than on the political element, because I think that's the bigger part that I want to be as an influencer. And I wish it didn't have to be so hard to do it, but I still believe that other people can relate to a human story beyond the political party that they ascribe to.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you.
This is Tyler. I just want one quick question to you, David, as we prepare to have Rebecca join us next week. In your conversations with her and the events that you all hosted, are there any questions or topics that you recommend that we ask Rebecca about or encourage to explore dialogue with, whether it was things that stood out to you or that you found to be particularly meaningful to previous audiences? Would just be curious of your perspective on that.
Yeah, no, I think you've got a good set of questions already from this discussion. But you know, I think a good artist really never finishes a piece of work. They just they abandon it. They kind of stop working on it. And so I'd be curious to know like what she's learned or heard or picked up through these talks that, you know, if she was gonna, you know, she's not gonna rewrite the book, she's not gonna do a second volume, but if she had, is there any nugget of something that she picked up? She's like, oh, that was good. I should have put that in, or I should have, or I could have, because she's been talking to a lot of people subsequent, a lot of people from this era, a lot of fans of the book. It'd be interesting to me where her mind goes now around this, and what she's working on now. I mean, I'm sure I know she's working on a screen adaptation that's going to be filmed, and that's also an interesting process. And you know, how do you tell the story now for film? You know, so.
Great.
Yep, that's great. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a good one.
Okay, and I think with that, we are maybe coming to the end of this book and this book club. As I say, next week, I think I'm hoping it's going to be, you know, sort of like a motivating and interesting talk with Rebecca. I'm really looking forward to it. I've been in touch with her off and on over the last couple of months, and I'm really looking forward to getting into a conversation with her and having you guys get into a conversation with her. So I would be more than happy to sit back and have you guys talk with her. So come with your questions.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And I think with that, thank you all very much. And David, thank you again. We really want this.
That was fun. Thank you.
Thank you, David. You were wonderful.
Thank you.
So much. Thanks, book clubbers.
Yep.
Thank you, Nabila. And Devin and Tyler.
Yeah. Thanks
everybody.
Bye.